Hey everybody, so we're going to go ahead and start on our next module. In this one, we're going to be talking about media and we're going to be talking about education. And the reason I put these two together is because I think when we talk about the main socialization processes that aren't the family, those are really the top two. These are the places where we learn about others as well as ourselves and the identities that we carry. And so, because school and the things that we watch are really our first primary social places where we learn about individuals that are not like us, whether that be race, whether that be age, whether that be cultural background, whether that be gender, whether that be any of the identity categories that we would hold. I think that it's important to kind of highlight these two areas as part of that socialization process. And we're going to talk a lot about how that socialization process has been different for a wide variety of us. But first, we're going to start with the media. Now, listen, we could do an entire chapter on each one of these particular media elements. Like there could be an entire class on media representation or misrepresentation and or lack of representation for people of color. So note that this is a very abridged version, right? This is not the whole story. This is the part of the story we can get in and still be able to do other things. Now, again, if you want information on any particular part of this module or with any particular group on this particular topic, please don't hesitate to reach out because this is something that is important. It's something that's consistently talked about in broader spaces. And it's something that as we go through media, we could also do almost all of these categories and break them up into, media centered on youth, media centered on young adults, media centered on adults, and we could divvy it up that way as well, and make a really awesome textbook and or chapters upon chapters when it comes to these topics. So please don't think I am intentionally leaving anything out. It is just I am trying to go over what I could add on to things in the book, and kind of stay focused and stay task oriented. I also was intentional on leaving the white male person drawing on the media board up here. And the reason I do that is because it's a visual representation, again, of who is making our media, of who makes decisions about our media, and of who genuinely gets to decide all of the things: who writes it, who produces it, who directs it, who makes money off of it, who the intended viewer audience is. All of these things are surrounded around white men. And so I want to make that very clear. And so him essentially drawing these things or looking like he is on this is intentional. All right, so let's go get into this media chapter. All right, so we're going to go over a little bit of history. We're going to go over a little bit of things, and then we're going to break down those stereotypes even further and kind of talk about what they are, and talk about cultural appropriation and just race in the media. And I went into several different things, and I also added some that weren't media sources that weren't in the book, because I think they're important as well. All right, so let's talk. Again, I've already kind of hit the fact that this is a primary institution for socializations, for norms, ideologies, and even for change, right? When we talk about our media, we tend to think about it in the ways of, does it represent me? Is this fictional? Is this realistic? But we also don't question things that we don't feel related to. And that's part of the problem. And so what it ends up doing is leaving the calls for change directly on the people who are being misrepresented or who are being not represented, as opposed to thinking outside of the social bubble in which we operate. Oh, goodness. I'm actually doing these way earlier in the day today. I'm still yawning. I don't know what my deal is. Um, all right. So we're going to get into the specific types of stereotypes, but more broadly, stereotypes happen very often in media. They are consistently harmful, and they come from our history. They come from legacy of human interactions and specifically power dynamics, right? So stereotypes are a way in which to keep the status quo. They're a way in which to demoralize or dehumanize or to render someone less than in order to keep positionality at the top of that hierarchy. And so it's something that, especially when we talk about race, white people have created over the course of time to justify um, notions of violence, justify things and policies, and justify things like slavery, justify things like colonialization. And it's been used as a way to rid oneself of guilt or to, again, make oneself a white savior or to give someone the ability to need saving in the first place. Um, and this could be based on religion. This could be based on social crime. This could be based on um, economics. It can be based on gender. All of these things. You can see a lot of these different stereotypes playing out in our media. Just look at, and in a prime example, look at the way in which Appalachia is depicted in the media. Look at the way people of color in Appalachia are depicted in the media. And that's something that's very local, something that's talked about. But as we've noticed, there's been this cultural, I don't know, moment where there tended to be this, like, I don't know, in the last, I feel like 5 years, um, multiple movies, films, TV shows, theater, books, things of that nature written specifically about Appalachia that were not written by anyone who's been anywhere near Appalachia and have been done so in very stereotypical ways. Now, on the flip side, there's also some really good things coming out of Appalachia. There's some really good books. There's some especially good poetry coming out of Appalachia, etc. But again, allowing people to not make media that is representative of self gets people in situations where stereotypes are very easy to occur. And that's because this is not something that, like in this case, as we're talking about in race, um, if you are a white person writing all these stories, man, what is wrong? Okay, writing all these stories about Black people or Latinx people or people from Asiatic places with absolutely zero experience or life experiences to relate to these individuals at a systemic level or even at a personal level, that's going to create problems because you're not writing about things you know, you're writing about things that you think you know. And those are two very different things. And it's important. It's important to talk about it. It's the reason why, even as an educator, there's a positionality statement that I start this class off with. These are things I can talk about from a very educated place, but not from a personal place because I do not experience the life as a person of color. And so while I can teach the things that have happened throughout history and make sure that things that have been swept under the rug are not in this class, I cannot look at you and say, I have experienced this and know how it feels. Now, in some of my other classes, I can absolutely do that. I can absolutely talk about how gender is has been experienced by me as a woman, as a cis woman, right? I can absolutely talk about disability. I can, as a white woman, though, right? My perspective is still tenured on my positionality. And I think that that's something that when we get into media isn't talked about as much because the assumption is that you can write a story about anyone and fully get it right. And that's not always the case. That doesn't mean that people can't write stories with many diverse characters in them and have representation be there and have some authenticity to those characters. But that requires a significant amount of listening, a significant amount of reading, a significant amount of intentionality. And especially as we get into this, we're going to talk about that some more. All right. So these stereotypes also shape the way people of color are viewed by others. Again, that outward view that so much media has that influences us on the rest of the world, on how the world appears. I mean, even our news outlets, right? There are so many Americans that, because we do not study world history in the same way some other countries do, look at the world through a very Americanized lens. And when we do that, we have a lot less conversations about what happens in war-stricken areas that maybe even European white folks would have to have conversations about, because they are much closer, because their refugee patterns are different, because there's not an ocean in between them and some of these wars, right? So there are things that, due to your positionality globally, you can step back from and or filter through a very distinct lens. The problem with that is that when you get into situations like, say, the Russia and Ukraine war right now, so many Americans, because they are just not viewing the world in this global lens, are going to look at that and say, okay, but how does this impact me? Right? Or they're going to say, so what? Or there's a disconnect, right, between that and the lived experiences here in a lot of ways, because those lived experiences aren't shared, right? And we're going to see that a lot as we talk about some of these other stereotypes in media. All right, so let's talk about the history of media real quick. Just some this is mostly on film, but again, just some backstory. We'll get into a couple other things when we move through some of the different media types or outlets. But we have, like your book talks about, Amos and Andy, and really this, really the use of blackface in early media, the way in which there was a mass amount of dehumanization of Black people, of Indigenous people, of really any kind of Latinx person. That came a wee bit later in our history. But this show was incredibly popular and aired till 1953. There's also a wide amount of issues still. I mean, think about this. If you get cable packages or what have you, how many Westerns can you find on daytime TV? And how many people are still watching them? And the messaging that those things continue to have is very colonialistic. It paints Indigenous people in a very homogenized and gross way. It over-sexualizes the women and makes them the lure for white lust. It has super, super problematic things in it. But these are still being played over and over and over again, despite the fact that we, as a society at this point, should be at a place where we could say, hey, this Cowboys and Indians thing is incredibly offensive, and we should probably seek better ways to initiate media. In the 1980s, really representation of Black people, and specifically switched over to kind of that Black family sitcom kind of era, the Bill Cosby show, the Maori sisters and their show. What's the name of it? I watched the show. I don't remember. Sister to Sister. And then you have things like, especially in the 90s, there was like a ton of sitcoms. You had Family Matters. You had thinking. They're represented in my TV, and I read a lot for prepping for this, so there's going to be a lot of things that I may not get the words out the way I want them to, but I'm trying to remember all of the things that I was talking about. But what this particular era did was create this enlightened racism. And that enlightened racism is this idea that, well, look at this perfect family that never experiences racism, and all of their problems are very similar to white people problems. Look at, they're in a brownstone, they're wealthy-ish or middle class at least. Everyone's successful, everyone's going to be successful. And it creates this idea that really, if you are in an underserved community, or if you are a person of color that is struggling due to systemic and institutionalized racism, that doesn't really exist. You just need to try harder. Because look, this family did it, despite the fact that this family is very fictional and that there's a lot that is not covered in these stories. There is still a very, it's still hindered on these ideas that were very white middle class centered, right? That's not to say that this representation and this shift in representation wasn't a good step. That's not what I'm saying, because the fact that there were families and that these families were people of color, and that these families weren't being depicted as, welfare queens or single parents or living in a ghetto or what have you, in these very stereotypical roles, those were positive things. The problem is that they weren't talking about topics that might offend white people, because white people were still making the show. They had to make it relatable. Well, they didn't have to. They chose to make it relatable to white people because that was the audience they were seeking. And again, without representation of racism, then there was more white people that could talk about it no longer existing. And I think that that's something that we're getting a little better at with media coverage at this point, especially in our TV shows. But you have to look for the right kind of TV shows, because if you're watching mostly cop dramas, you're not going to be centered around those topics as much, and you're still going to get a lot of tropes about criminalization of male people of color. All right. You see a lot of talk about the Black athlete. This is something that if you turn on ESPN at any given moment, you're going to get these stories, right? You're going to get this story where you're going to either get no story, or you're going to get a like super idealistic story of the white athlete versus the Black athlete who comes into any kind of legal trouble or any kind of drinking underage or appearing at parties or smoking pot or what have you. It's going to be considered like they're going to be showing the mug shots. They're going to be showing them as degenerative, as opposed to a white kid, especially if you're talking about college sports of any kind. The white kid's always going to be like, well, what about his future? And how, like, this was just a misstep, kids will be kids, blah, 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 blah. And there's going to be two completely different dynamics about that story and how it's going to be told. You're also going to see a lot of this idea of, well, look at all the hurdles this Black athlete has had to overcome, and not in like a compassionate way of like, hey, these are systemic problems that we should be facing so that our education system is more equitable. But instead it's going to be like, well, he didn't have a father, and he was in a drug torn area, et cetera, meant to really be like almost this backhanded compliments of self-worth or self gratification. And the wording is intentional, right? I talk regularly about the fact that language is something that holds intentionality and that it's really, really important. Well, the language, when you talk about these two different stories, is indicative of the biases in which they are trying to perpetuate, or even unintending to perpetuate, but are. And it's something that we as humans, when we watch the news, when we do these things, need to start recognizing so that we can critically think about the media in which we engage with. Past 9/11, pretty much anyone that was of Muslim descent or practicing in any way, shape, or form that was depicted on the media was in a terrorist portrayal. Well, male was in a terrorist portrayal. If they were female, then they were pitied. They were someone to be saved. Obviously, they didn't know any better, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Super demoralizing in ways that didn't necessarily happen prior. I mean, they were always othered, um, but not always done to this degree of violence. They weren't essentially targets all the time. Prior to this, you saw a lot of Russians being the bad guys in TV shows. You saw a lot of Iraqis, and there weren't always. It was more nationalistic than it was an entire religious base that is global and widespread. Um, and so there was a bit of difference there, and we'll get into that a bit more. Um, when we talk about any of the Asiatic uh, identity base, especially those with fairer skin, you're going to hear a term called model minority talked about. And essentially, that is the idea that these are the people who are getting assimilation right. These are the people who are not doing race wrong. Um, they're going to be depicted as much more intelligent, much more hardworking. The cultural qualities in which get attached to these individuals from possible positions of origin or places of origin are going to be more positive than a lot of the other racial categories. And also, the fairness of their skin is going to consider them far closer to whiteness. And then when you really look at our media just in general, there is very little to no indigenous representation. Like, so very little. What is there is not fabulous. I mean, you're going to see it in westerns, you're going to see them in sometimes the coverage of social movements. You're going to see it, and that's only sometimes. You're going to see it in occasionally other movies. The most you're probably going to see it of any media outlet is probably going to be in a specific type of video game where you're doing any kind of evolutionary based resource gathering kind of games. You see a lot of indigenous people in those, but that's not always a positive representation at all. Trying to think. There's just not. You do have Reservoir Dogs on one of the media centers. Which one is it? It's either Hulu or Netflix, I think. But again, it's just comparatively, you're not going to see near as much as you should. All right, so let's talk about why this discrepancy in these representations happen. A lot of them happen because of and they went into a lot of data from 2000 and let me look, I think it's 16. It is 2016, yeah. So I went in and found some of the same data for 2021. So here's 2011 all the way to 2021. And this is the distribution of lead actors. The light blue here is white. This dark navy color is any people of color in totality. And then the breakdown for this is a little bit better over here. And that's just this idea that the reason these misrepresentations happen are that essentially it's incredibly normal for there not to be any people of color, and not just in the actual representation, not just in the lead characters, but also in the writing booths, in the production booths, in the directing spot or chair, in the heads of the companies who make the decision on what to make, in the editing rooms, in the even in the people who view this as audience or critics, right? Like And not a wide audience. I'm talking about the ones that they pick specifically to like gauge whether or not the movie's going to do well. Um, Most of the people that are in all of these positions are white, and that's a problem because then again you get that discrepancy of storytelling. Um, Media is molded again by what we deem important and by what the people who are making the media deem are important. So just because it's important to white males over the age of 40 does not mean that that is what's important to everyone, but it's also going to shape the younger groups version and ideologies of what they are going to deem as important as they move forward and see this as their media options. Now, that's not to say that there are not people advocating for better media options always. There's always a push for change within this particular genre, right? Within this institution. And again, whose responsibility is it to change? Is it the companies? Because they're out essentially in a capitalist society, they're out to make money and whatever that means. So if the majority of the audience is still white, do we still make white dominated television? Where is there capacity for something more? And I think one of the movies that pretty much made the selling point that there needs to be more and that there's a massive industry and market and place for is when Black Panther, the first Black Panther came out. This was a movie pretty much primarily Black actors. There's a couple of white people in there, but they're side characters at best or villains. You have the writers, the directors, the producers at every level. It was intentionally Black and intentionally African. And I make the distinction because there were Black US actors and Black actors specifically from Africa, that their African heritage and nationality is incredibly important to include in that conversation because those two are not one and the same. They're not interchangeable. And what I loved about this is that there was so much talk about how much money they were pouring into it and how little they were going to get in returns. And it just did amazing. It wasn't just amazing in the US, it was amazing worldwide. And that in and of itself was showing people in positions of power that white narratives aren't the only narratives that are capitalistically, I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm going to make it one, viable, right? So that's not the only thing you're going to make money on. Okay, before we get into stereotypes, which is our next section, hold on. I want you to see this particular one. I'm going to link all these links in I'll make a folder that's something to the extent of links from your lectures. But these are all really cool, really relatively short, they're like under 7 minutes mostly. I think the only one that's not is the indigenous stereotypes, and that's because it's not done by the same people. But it's a good conversation about all these different stereotypes that we're going to talk about. And it gives really good examples, and it's quick and it's fast paced, and you can skip over my part if you need to kind of grasp what these particular terms are talking about. All right, so let's get into the stereotypes themselves. So I did this in alphabetical order because I did not want to promote that any one particular groups and their stereotypes are less than or create a hierarchy within my own language about this topic. So I did it in a way that was categorical and alphabetical. And so that way there was less conversation. However, I did intentionally put women in the category prior to men. And that's just because systemically it is the opposite. And I like to break patterns too. All right. So let's talk about these stereotypes. We're going to start with Arab individuals, and that's also going to include and specifically cater towards Muslim individuals. However, those in Arabic nations are not always, or with that category, aren't always considered people of color. Some are not Muslim, some are Christian, some are Israeli, some are there's a wide range of people. And as with most of these categories, the putting them into one homogenous group doesn't give them credit for the amount of cultural diversity and lived experiences that are part of this. However, when you talk about them in the media, they tend to get all of these groups tend to get homogenized into specific categorical like stereotypes, but also like these roles that are played over and over and over and over again, where the actors themselves don't have chances to play in depth or vibrant characters. All right, so let's talk about this particular category first. You're going to see a lot of veiled women. You're going to see a lot of this seductress where you're only going to see their eyes, but they're going to be in these hip covering genie-like outfits almost. They're going to be talked about as intentionally trying to seduce their white counterparts or be a lure of some kind. You're going to see also a lot of maiden, and that's just this idea of particularly working for or working with women, white women. All right, and then for the men, we talked about this already, but you're going to see a lot of the terrorist role. Then you also have this immoral billionaire. You're going to see this a lot in, especially when we're talking about anyone of Indian descent. And you're also going to talk about the haggler or the street vendor or the street marketer or somebody who's intent on being very sketchy in their salesmanship or merchandising. All right. When we talk about the Asian, particularly population, you're going to see two major ones for women. You're going to see the dragon lady and the butterfly. And for whatever reason, I always get these backwards. So I'm going to make sure I don't. The dragon lady is essentially very crafty, destructive seductress. She's going to be your femme fatale types. They're going to be the ones that are going to have a lot of possibly martial arts backgrounds, going to be a lot of not what they seem at first. They may be pretending to look meager or meek, but are going to end up kicking ass and taking names, but not necessarily in the most positive or powerful, empowering way. And then you're going to see the butterfly, and the butterfly is going to be that meek, that devoted, very submissive wife, specifically to white men. All right. And then for the men, you're going to see the buddy, which is essentially just that funny-esque like character. When you think about this, think about what's his name? The actor who plays in all of the Hangover movies and always ends up running around naked. That's an like example of this particular thing, but it's specifically going to have a lot of humor at the expense of this person, and or it's going to be a very one note type character. You're going to see a threatening foreigner, and usually that's going to be indicative to like any kind of representation of a triad gang or any type of gangster just in general. You're going to see a lot of martial artists, and usually these are going to be intertwined with everything in every category because all Asians apparently are martial arts experts, and that's how Hollywood has depicted them. This is, I say apparently, and I'm saying this dripping with sarcasm. And then you have the corporate businessman, or essentially the person that is very educated, very hardlined, usually with very little like sense of humor, very one note and economically driven. All right. So for Black individuals, you get the most kind of stereotypes that were talked about. And that's because while their roles have been extended, um, and the portrayals of these individuals have extended the amount of roles that they can do, it's also extended the amount of stereotypes that people are put into. So let's talk about women. So you have essentially um so you have the bitch, which is just a like very outspoken, aggressive, even type woman. And what's pisses me off about all these categories is that usually they just are women of color asserting themselves in some way or demanding that they don't be treated like a piece of meat. And that particular um, notion has been turned in on its head in media to depict them as particularly salacious or particularly aggressive. The bad bitch is really this very sexualized, very materialistic. It's it has been to an extent reclaimed, which I love. Right? Think Lizzo. Think um, Lizzo song. Think several songs from Beyonce also talk about this particular term, and taking it on its head and saying, "Yeah, I am excelling at this particular capitalist venture, and I can make my money, and I can be assertive, and I can flaunt my body because it's mine." And none of that makes me invaluable as a human. None of that makes me in any less empowered. And so I do love that this particular term and this particular trope has kind of been turned on its head relatively recently. And I hope to see more of that. And then you have the bad Black mother, who is essentially the welfare queen, or the has too many children, or the isn't really around, or um, creates children that are problems, or is neglectful, or is um, abusive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, all of the bad mom category, though, includes being a single mom. Um, you have the female athlete, and again, that's going to be the conversation surrounding, say, the um, Venus and Serena Williams. Like, talk about any of the hype, the media coverage surrounding them, and that's going to be a prime example of the Black athlete and how it's talked about within the media and the stereotyping that was done of those women and their bodies, and their juxtaposition to the white tennis player, female tennis players, even down to what they wore, what their whether or not their hairstyles were going to be allowed, whether or not um, they were allowed to not wear skirts, whether allowed they were too loud when they made sounds when they played tennis. I mean, just absurd amounts of unrelated things to the actual athletic prowess of the individual. And on the flip side, talking about their worth as only their athletic prowess, again, tying back and taking away from any kind of empowerment that someone could feel by their achievements. So you're also going to see the modern mammy, and that's particularly going to be talking about any kind of servant, any kind of house worker, any kind of person that's essentially working for a white couple, family, et cetera, et cetera. And not always a white family, but prime by like 95% of the time it's a white family. Um, and just kind of talking about that particular categorization. So like the movie The Help, that's a prime example of that particular narrative. Um, then you're going to see The Black Lady, which is essentially this very promiscuous and it was designed to counter this idea of promiscuous, but it really focuses on wanting to be at home. It focuses on not wanting to be educated. Again, really taking all these ideas of any place where Black women could be or encounter any kind of empowerment and flipping them on their head to make it a negative. That is something that is incredibly prominent in this particular categorization. And then you talk about the educated black bitch, which is essentially she has money, she has power, and she has a job. She's beautiful, and her sex specifically is demands her or depends on her being able to um, be tamed by men. So think characters like the head, the lead in How to Get Away with Murder, right? So like she's an incredibly powerful black woman with a lot of legal prowess, a lot of um, education, who has made her way in the world. However, um, has this issue with her white husband, has this issue with the white university, has these issues with specifically consistently the problems being racial in nature that keep getting thrown at her, and her needing to um, be tamed or be simmered down or be shut down by this particular to get rid of that kind of sassiness or that even pride in her own work. All right, so when you talk about the men, you're going to see the overwhelming arching theme of athlete, that this particular feature is the sole worth of black men. You're going to see a lot of thug and gangster connotations, that you're either going to be an athlete or a thug. Those are your two options, and that's super ugly on a number of levels. You're going to see the black pimp, or this black male who is intentionally using misogyny as a form of power, whether it be in violence against women, whether it be in selling their bodies, whether it be in just physical power over women in general. You're going to see the black rapist, which again is another fixation of that same ideology, except that instead of in reference to black female bodies, it's going to be in reference to white female bodies. And so then it gets turned into a criminal behavior as opposed to an enterprise. And that's going to be, again, more to do with the race, gender of the women intentionality than it is going to be of because that particular, those two particular caricatures are going to be essentially driven on the same ideas, but against two different types of, or two different categories of a woman. The black rapist is also, like, I have an amazing piece on the myth of the black rapist and how it was used and tied to violence against black men and the criminality of black men. Sorry about that. Of particular time periods. So if you want that, it is amazing. But primarily, most domestic violence and sexual violence is done interracially as opposed to intraracially and instead of interracially. So essentially, it's going to be the victim and the perpetrator are going to be of the same race more often than not. And then you're going to see the sidekick or the black buddy who's always there to serve kind of the white person's interest, and or another version of this lies in the gay black best friend, right? That's consistently a trope in most white romantic comedies here of late. And it falls under the same thing, right? It's a loyalness to white people. It's something that is meant to be very asexual in that particular atmosphere. It's meant to be nonviolent, safe, and non-threatening. So it's a way to kind of look at particular type of black men, but look at them as a way of being akin to white people or a role they can play that's non-threatening to white people. It has very little to do with the actual human, and those humans have generally very little like actual character development or multi-noted character achievement in these movies or roles. And then you have the sissy, which is the effeminate and that is very derogatory towards Black masculinity. This is going to be your gay characters, your queen, and it reinforces heterosexuality of others. All right. And then what am I doing? And then you're going to get into indigenous characters, and you're going to get into the squab. You're going to get into essentially the princess, think Pocahontas, the matriarch, think the old willow, or any kind of strong indigenous woman's going to be very much indicative of this matriarchal character, but done so in a way that is a threat to patriarchy or a threat to womanhood, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then for the men, you're going to see the savage note a lot, especially when you get back into those Westerns. The sidekick, again, the Westerns are going to be a prime example of this. The wise elder, or the person you go to for any kind of advice, or especially to move along a plot, and or the doomed warriors, where they're very strong and confident, and again, supposed to be something that you can have pride in, but instead are going to take and make very one note and take their loss as something that's inevitable. Latinx, you're going to see, especially with the women, this hot-blooded Latina, which is going to be hypersexualized. It's going to be talked about as being very malicious or being very sneaky. You have the maid, again, that's going to fall back into that mammy role. It's going to be the Latina version of that particular framework. You have the abuela, which is essentially that same framework as that matriarch or wise elder kind of ideology. And then you're going to have your Mexican Spitfire, which is essentially that woman who's out to get whatever she's out to get, whether it be economic gain, whether it be a job, whether it be a human, whether it be I don't know, possibly something for their children, etc. But she's gonna go and she's gonna stir up the pot. She's gonna make sure that whatever it is she was aiming for, or striving for, she gets. Now, again, not all of these qualities are bad things. The problem is that when you turn them on your head and you use them as a way to use and make one particular type of people only that, then you take away the nuance that is human experience, and you take away the fact that not everyone is this in all parts of their life, right? Like, I can be a crazy spitfire when it comes to anything related to medical advocacy for my kiddo, right? Like, that's just part of who I am, but it's not the only part of who I am. And to most people who know me, I am an incredibly calm and level human. That's just the nature of who I am. But if you're an insurance company, that's not the nature of who you think I am. And the reason for that is because we are different people in different social settings. And what stereotypes do is not enable the full scope of those interactions or those changes to be examined, to be talked about, or to even be present. And that's a problem, because it doesn't allow us to really navigate or understand human at a human level. They become this particular derogatory thing that we can discredit. All right. And then lastly, the Latino men, or you're going to see your Latin lover. This is going to be specifically tied to dancing more often than not. You're going to see your bandito, which is just going to be your mob style, think West Side Story types. You're going to see your gangbangers, which is going to be any cop drama at any point that you see. You're going to see your gardener, the help. Essentially, this falls back into that same trope. And you're going to see the buffoon, which is really just the person who's just that sidekick, or that which is that reoccurring, of the buddy, right? This is going to be that humor at their expense type character. All right. And again, if you want more understanding of those, go back to those stereotypes in the media, particular YouTubes. They're going to pull out examples, and they're going to be over dramatized examples, and it's fabulous because it really gets the point across. All right, so let's talk about media platforms real quick. New racism is this juxtaposition of old and new, in some cases, a continuation of longstanding practices of racial rule, and in some cases, the development of something original. The new racism reflects essentially sediment of past and present racial formation from prior historical periods. So this is essentially just taking things and justifying certain kinds of violences. Controlled images are the race, class, and gendered media depictions of what African Americans are and are not. It also then again is defining white people by based on what Black isn't or is. Does that make sense? So like they become this polarized duality, but we know that that doesn't really accurately display humans. And gender has a lot to do with controlling images because depending on who you are and the gender you have, there's going to be even more desire to have society control those images or make those images into denoting human worth so as to keep a multitude of hierarchical structures in place. There's a lot of expansion of this topic of controlling images to not just African Americans, but this use, especially as of late in political rhetoric surrounding immigration policy of any kind of Mexican person and or a person from any place in Central America. You're going to see a lot of expansion of this again post 9/11 in communicating about Muslim individuals, etc. So this can be tied into that notion of essentially any particular group that you want to keep power away from have the ability to have controlling images be used against them. And the three consequences for people of color are really are three options, I guess, is a more accurate word for that. But you can internalize or accept these ideas or imagery as reality. You can resist and develop your own imagery, or really ignore them. And that's kind of your options. All right. So as we get into this, it's going to be very overwhelming for some, but this is picture collages attached to all of these. And they're going to have positive and negative imagery in there to kind of represent some of those stereotypes, but then also places where things have grown. So let's get into video games. So there's stereotyping that are both present and also stereotyping that's been a lot of counter. Something to talk about specifically when it comes to stereotyping and or just things that consistently get wrong in video games. There is lots of conversation about black hair, why people cannot get black hair right when it comes to any kind of animation or any kind of characters. And I put this in here because this is a prime example, right? Like there's hair wispies everywhere. And just the way in which these are done is not congruent with how well some of the other characters in this particular game's hair is done. Latinx are overrepresented in sports, particular related games, Asians in fighting style games, right? So you've got this going on over here. And women particularly are very consistently in as lustful like characters. Your black characters are see all three above. So they're going to be targets of violence. They're going to be fighting games. They're going to be in sports related games, right? You're going to, and I skipped over the Arabs, but they're going to be consistently targets of violence, right? Anyone with a hijab more than likely is getting shot at. Unless you see some of the new stuff in like the Sims characters and things of that nature where you can have better options for creating your own sim. You see a very much a lack of black women characters in video games. And there's serious misrepresentation in those characters and based on who develops these games. Again, primarily game developers, depending on where you're from, are coming out of either Asiatic places. Japan specifically does a lot of gaming material, and white Eurocentric places. And then if you look at this, you have a struggle for indigenous characters of any kind of modern era. So you see your warrior styles over here. You see your this one is actually a decent game. But that is few and far between. And that one is actually particularly, I believe, was created by an indigenous person, which helps. But you're going to see a lot of these warrior tropes. You're going to see a lot of these spirituality tropes where you get your animals to play with too. A lot of the tropes of, again, warrior, lots of warriors, and then caricatures that are really, really icky and intentionally discriminatory. So when we talk about social media, there's the propensity for some social media to be really positive because it is user generated content, and it's formed and created a lot of movement for social movements, especially any of your hashtag movements. So I use the example of Cite Black Women, but there's a bunch of them in here intentionally. But you also, on the other side, have very racialized memes. I tried not to put them in here because I don't want to. But you also have the ability for overt hate, I mean, to be often go unpunished and not really be looked at, and to have a degree of anonymity in that. And then you have a lot of bots and fake messaging that is creating a lot of misinformation. And so down here, I also put in your 4 types of information pollution to kind of give you a more valid conversation about the different kinds of examples. All right, so moving on to news media, we talked about this a lot, but it's used to help justify the incarceration of Black men. And we're going to get into that again some more when we talk about the coverage of that more broadly. It's going to be used to justify war and violence to Muslim people, to justify less social aid in general to those impoverished, and that overwhelmingly impacts minority persons, to justify harmful immigration policy built on false narratives of worthiness, especially when it comes to who essentially is worthy of being a refugee, who is worthy of being an American, and who is worthy of being able to be here illegally or legally, for that matter. All right. So our television, you will notice a lot of sci-fi and a lot of children's stuff in both the television and media. I have kids, so primarily what I'm watching is children's shows. But I'm also a big sci-fi nerd. And so things like when I think about the first kinds of representation, right, I can't not think about how many places Star Trek has had in television history of breaking racial boundaries, right? The first interracial kiss on primetime TV, right? The first, really the most diverse first group of individuals working in a relatively cohesive group. A lot of your first real good leader roles for people of color came in some of these series, right? That's not to say it is not without its problems, especially when it comes to race, but it does have a lot of first and is denoted. There's a lot of gender-based problems in that original series, which I could talk a lot about, but I'm not going to. But also, when you talk about really good Indigenous representation, I do enjoy the Indigenous representation that is in the sci-fi show Resident Alien. Reservoir Dogs is another good one. This is another historic moment where Mr. Rogers, in the middle of a conversation surrounding segregation, put his feet in the same pool on television as the Black officer that is part of the show, and really wanted to send a message of social change. Again, you have a lot of tropes in here as well, but really wanting to kind of talk about and get at some of how those give you some examples of both those good representational moments. Blackish is in there as well, to have really good conversations about some of those good things and some of the bad things. And again, television is also usually where change happens first when it comes to media, with the exception of social media to an extent. And that's just because um, movies are made well in advance, and so they take a minute to catch up. But television shows are made much more quickly. And so there's the ability to acknowledge current places and social positions. And so they have the ability to do that more rapidly in production itself, but also just because there's more of a demand for that, as it has the ability to broach multiple topics. Written work, and there this is overwhelming, but there's a lot of amazing books in here, especially if you have kids. If you have kids and want some amazing book lists, please talk to me, because um, we are very big bookworms in this household. And so I know we've come across quite a few that are just amazing, and just publishers in general for children's books that are amazing. Um, this is the most expansive form of media, right? This has been around the longest. But it also has its historical roots, right? It's who gets published and why and by who. And there's still um, companies, especially Black publishing companies or Indigenous publishing companies, that struggle to make ends meet because it is a white dominated media. Um, and so that's why I think it's important to find the right stories if you're going to find stories. I also, again, turn to the sci-fi genre because it allows there to be exploration of topics without having to necessarily point to current relations. So you can explore that within these characters or within these different groups in a way that allows particularly white audiences the ability to step out of the range of feelings that disassociate them from history. So that fear, that anxiety, that guilt, all of those things, in order to have realistic conversations about what happens to people in different groups, um, and disconnect them from those storylines. But in doing so, allowing space for consideration to be brought into those conversations later, right? To be talked about as you move forward in um, some of these really more societal based, real um, social issues. Um, they're serious. Okay, I can't say this enough, but young adult fiction, y'all, like if there was a genre of media that has the most diversity and the most comprehensive and well thought out and intentional diversity, young adult fiction is really doing amazing things. Um, and there's nothing wrong with reading young adult fiction as an adult, but also even if you get out of that, I think that because those young adults that are growing up with this particular um, surround are going to look for that in adult books and adult fiction upcoming. And so I think that what that's doing is going to give even those of us that read more of the adult fiction a better range of authorship, primarily because those who have been reading those young adult fictions are going to get older and they're going to demand that same kind of diversity in their reading. And I think that that's going to create a space probably in the next decade or so to really shape and change how that particular media is playing out. Libraries are libraries. I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but are safe places, and they're also very diverse places. They're things where diversity have been celebrated. This is not always, but it's something that, for the most part, in modern eras have been able to have places where skills might be taught, like how to fill out a job application, or how to do your taxes, or how to do certain things at a community level, or spaces where you can rent community space for free, or places where you can come in and read or sit without being disturbed, or told you have to get out, or places where you can get heat or food, depending on what kind of activities are going on at that places where children have readings that they can do and understand the worth of writing and of storytelling. And so it's really, I think they're important places. And I think this particularly genre of media is something that we will continue to need to fight for its existence. Then you get into theater, has a deep history of segregation and discrimination. On the flip side, it also has a deep history of various cultural understandings. And I say that because there is a performative nature to almost every culture there is. There's some kind of performance that is part of their cultural way of life. And because of that, theater is a great place to expound upon that or to give that to a more variety of audiences. And it's also a place to kind of, it's always been a place that challenges power, or it has been a place to seek change or have radical stories, radical storytelling. And I think that that in and of itself has created space in theater for a lot of change to happen. And we're going to talk about that a little when we talk about some of the Brown Enough chapters. And then it's also a comedy as a form of beauty, but it also can be making fun of people. Again, you've got that history of blackface, that history of using characters of color as comedic, like the butt of the joke, essentially. Theater companies are also places to be community driven. So you have a lot of, at this point, Latinx community driven theater. You have a lot of Black community theaters. You have a lot of theaters that are based in the community in which they work in, and that's really, really good. Again, on the flip side, you have a lot of whitewashing of roles and some major stereotyping issues, especially in those reproduction kind of plays that have been going on for decades and decades and decades. So music, all US music genres, this is super important. So listen up, have been influenced or are directly descendant of people of color and or the cultures that are not European. Almost every kind of US music stems from instruments used, stems from music melody types, stems from singing variations, like tunes of other cultures, right? American music is in no way, shape, or form white. And that is something that I don't think a lot of people like to hear. Cultural appropriation, we're going to get into that a lot here in a minute, so I'm not going to dive too much into that right now. Music has been classed in the way of who gets to decide who's going to play an instrument, or whether or not you have music class even in your schools, or whether or not or what particular kind of music you're allowed to or supposed to listen to, right? And that goes right along with what music is validated. I'm going to tell you that no matter how much misogyny is in rap, there is equal amounts of misogyny in rock, in country music, in I'm trying to think, in pop music, right? That is not a reason to justify the invalidation of what rap music is, because that particular genre of music tends to get the brunt of the majority of discrediting. That's the one I'm going to talk about. But it was a form of resilience. It was a form of social resistance. It's always been a form of expressing oppression and inequality. And that's something that, again, when you think about what gets to be formed out, what particular songs get chosen to put on the radio versus the songs that might be sang elsewhere, or the raps that might be played more prominently in communities, you're going to see that, again, even though production of and those who are actually doing the rapping are primarily people of color, the people who are producing the music still are to some degree people of color, but the people whose companies and production companies go into the money making, even of Motown Records, of etc., have primarily been white. And so when you have this disconnect between a community talking about an experience and that of those who don't experience it, there's a disconnect. And so in order to try to make some kind of connect or make it sellable, it tends to be one noted or take away those messagings of change, of resistance, of resilience. But if you dig into the history of rap and even the rap albums that are currently out, you're going to find a lot more of that than you are going to on just particular types of radio or what have you. And then the last one is movies. Again, I can do an entire topic on children's animated movies and their particular harms or lack there of representation or of homogenized representation, and or even some of the good things that are coming out. So like if you haven't seen Strange Worlds, you need to. It's super cute. If you haven't seen Abominable, that one I love. I think it's a really good idea. My kids love Cubo. That's like their go-to. I'm trying to think of, Big Hero 6 is another big one in this house. Vivo, of course, Encanto and Coco, Moana. The kids around these parts are all about their sing-songy types, but they're starting to get into more other stuff. But my oldest loves any kind of anime. We've had to have lots of conversation about gender and anime, which I could also get into for a long time, but I'm gonna divert back. There's a lot of messaging that happens in children's movies, especially, and that's the reason why I have covered so much in that children's section over here. And that's just because it's important to understand where these messagings are going and what they're saying, and who's being represented in what ways. Because you go into the world and then that's the expectation of these people, and that's not always an accurate representation or expectation of these people. You also saw, speaking of social media being attached to movies, you see a lot of any kind of discriminations or lack of representation being brought up in the media. So things about the Oscars being incredibly white and then that having changed, but then it kind of, with every positive, there's always a backlash. Remember that's the way every social movement has been throughout all of time and space. And you've seen a lot of the new Avatar has a lot of indigenous people have a lot of issues with it due to its cultural appropriation, but also its inability to show a more well thought out indigenous character. And then you have, again, the children's movies. History is has a long history of harm, and we could go back into a lot of these conversations. But again, talking about your westerns, talking about your mammy roles, talking about blackface, or talking about the way in which Peter Pan talked about indigenous people. Right, you can talk about all of these really negative things, and some of it is really, really rough. And there's still a lot of work to be done. On the flip side, you have movies like that made history, like, I just talked about this movie, The Black Panther. Goodness gracious. You have the entire MCU current chapter. I don't know how they break them down anymore. They break them down in a plethora of ways, but where they were really getting at characters that weren't as white. You have Disney doing movies like Moana, doing movies like Strange World, where there are attempts to branch out from that particular white family role, and or even that Disney princess as needing a partner, or et cetera, et cetera. Again, I think that Abominable is an amazing movie. So trigger warning, death of parent, because it's a children's movie, so a parent has to die. I don't know what that particular problem is within children's movies. But it's frustrating. Also, if you want to talk about children's TV shows, this one's a little older, but She-Ra is a big thing in this household. Um, so is what's the other one that they love? Um, I don't know. There's a bunch I could get into. So if you want any kind of or have questions about diversity when it comes to particular genres or age ranges of children's shows, please don't hesitate to reach out, for I have done nothing but watch them for the last decade. um, all right, let's get back into this. And I believe that cultural appropriation is our last particular part of media. So I'm going to take a pause here, then I'll come back to that so that we can give it its time and its space. All right, let me get this out of the way.